She came to the barn to clear out her father's belongings, but she didn't expect to find a rusty safe under the floorboards, which had been kept secret for decades. She opened it, and that's when the family began to fall apart. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you're watching from. The road leading back to Willow Creek felt smaller than Miriam remembered, as if time had tightened its grip around the landscape and shrunk everything she once knew. The bare November trees arched over the narrow highway like old, tired guardians, their branches scratching at the fading sky. The air smelled of cold earth and wood smoke, and every mile seemed to peel back a layer of distance she had tried so hard to build over the years. She had spent a decade away from this place, living in cities where no one knew her name and no one cared where she came from. But now, with her father gone and nothing else anchoring her in the world, she found herself driving home, back to the land she once swore she would never return to. The closer she came to the old farm, the more her chest tightened, as though the very soil remembered her footsteps and the memories she had buried here, pressed upward, like roots breaking through pavement. When she finally pulled into the long gravel path that led to the main house, the sun was low, casting the farm in a muted orange glow. The house looked smaller, too, its once bright white siding now faded and peeling, the porch steps warped, the windows dull. Miriam sat in her car a moment longer than necessary, gripping the steering wheel, grounding herself. She tried to prepare for the faces she was about to see, for the voices of her brothers that held so little warmth and so much judgment. But nothing could truly prepare her for the blend of grief, resentment, and resignation that waited inside. The front door opened before she could knock. Her older brother Daniel stood in the doorway, broad-shouldered, arms crossed, the same stern line carved between his brows that he had worn since adolescence. His shirt was tucked neatly into his jeans, boots polished, as though appearances were armor. He didn't smile. He didn't even soften. "You're late," he said, stepping aside without invitation. Inside, the house smelled of dust and something older, something like the past itself lingering in the corners. Their younger brother, Adam, lounged on the sofa, tapping through messages on his phone. He looked up only when she entered the room, offering a smirk that held no welcome. "So the prodigal daughter returns," he said. "Didn't think you'd show." Miriam ignored him. She hung her coat by the door and sat stiffly in the nearest chair. An unfamiliar lawyer, short, balding, glasses glowing under the lamplight, was arranging papers on the dining table. He looked up at her with polite detachment, then cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. As you know, we're here to read the last will and testament of your father, Thomas Harper." The room fell into a silence so thick, Miriam could hear the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. She folded her hands in her lap, feeling the edges of her nails scrape against her skin, grounding herself. The lawyer began reading. His voice was flat, professional, but the words seemed to echo strangely in the dim room. Their father left the main house and surrounding farmland to Daniel and Adam jointly. The farm equipment, the livestock contracts, the bank accounts, the vehicles. Each item was listed with clinical precision, each handed over to her brothers. Miriam stared at the grain of the table, tracing its lines like fault lines through her life. "And to my daughter, Miriam Harper." The lawyer paused, adjusting his glasses, though there was nothing unclear on the page. "I leave the east barn and the land directly surrounding it." A long, heavy silence fell. Adam let out a laugh, sharp, loud, derisive. "The barn? Seriously? That place is half collapsed." Daniel shook his head, a humorless smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Guess he figured giving her something was better than nothing. The lawyer continued on, but Miriam heard little else. The words washed over her like the static hum of an old radio, meaningless, distant. All she could focus on was the barn, the place where she spent countless afternoons as a child, watching her father mend tools, where the smell of sawdust and oil had once felt like comfort. She had not stepped inside it in years. It had been abandoned long before she left town. When the will reading finally ended, Daniel walked out without another word. Adam lingered just long enough to throw a smirk her way. "You always said you wanted to make something of your life," he said. "Guess you can start with cleaning up bird crap." The door shut behind him, leaving her alone in the fading light. Outside, the sky had darkened into a deep navy blue, the first stars flickering through the branches. Miriam walked across the yard slowly, each step sinking into the soft earth. The barn stood at the end of a narrow path, its silhouette cutting a jagged shape against the horizon. Even from a distance, she could see its sagging roofline, the loose planks, the broken window panes. It looked exhausted, forgotten, like a monument to every memory she once tried to preserve. The outer door groaned when she pulled it open, the sound echoing inside the hollow space. The scent hit her immediately. Old hay, rusting metal, damp wood, and the faint, familiar trace of her father's tools. Dust motes floated in slanted beams of moonlight, drifting lazily like tiny ghosts. Though time had taken its toll, something about the barn felt undeniably alive-like. It remembered her footsteps and welcomed them with quiet recognition. She stepped inside, brushing past a dangling rope and the fragments of a broken wooden crate. Tools lay scattered across the floor, some half buried under piles of straw. A rusted wheelbarrow leaned against the far wall, untouched for decades. In the corner, the old workbench stood exactly where her father had left it, though now covered in cobwebs. The sight tightened something deep within her chest. She told herself she would clean tomorrow, but the barn seemed to beckon her deeper now, calling forward memories she had long buried. She crouched near the center of the barn and reached for a rake to clear debris. But as she dragged the old wood across the floor, something felt wrong. One of the boards did not shift like the others. It sounded hollow beneath her touch. She knelt and pressed her palm to it. The wood dipped slightly, as though it had been lifted before or loosened from below. A faint tremor ran through her fingertips as she traced its edges. Unlike the others, this board was darker, warped differently, as if it had been replaced at some point. With careful fingers, she wedged the broken end of the rake beneath the board and pried upward. The wood resisted for a moment before giving way with a soft crack. Dust rose in a thin cloud, revealing darkness beneath the floor. And then she saw it, the dull glimmer of metal beneath layers of dirt and cobwebs. Her breath caught. It wasn't a pipe or an old tool. It was square, heavy, solid, a safe, a real, old, rusted safe embedded between the beams. Her heart thudded so hard she felt it in her fingertips. She brushed away more dust until the metal revealed itself fully. The safe was thick with rust, its once black paint almost entirely worn away, the lock solid and unbroken. It looked older than any tool in the barn, older than anything her father had ever shown her. "What were you hiding down here?" she whispered to the dark floorboards around her. She sat back on her heels, staring at the strange shape in the ground, a quiet dread and wonder coiling together inside her. The safe didn't belong here. Her father had never mentioned it, and her brothers certainly knew nothing about it, or they would have torn the barn apart long ago. The air around her felt suddenly different, heavy, charged with something like expectation. The safe had been waiting, not for Daniel, not for Adam, for her. As the cold night crept into the barn and crickets sang from the distant field, Miriam remained seated above the safe, running her fingers absent-mindedly over its rusted edge. The barn's silence wrapped around her like a cloak, holding her still, anchoring her to a past she had fled but could no longer ignore. When she finally stood to leave, she felt as though she were stepping out of one life and into another. The moon shone down on the fields, lighting her path as she closed the barn doors behind her, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions and only one certainty. Her father had left her more than a broken barn. He had left her a secret, and now it was hers to uncover. Morning came slowly, with a pale and uncertain light, filtering through the thin curtains of the small guest room where Miriam had slept. She had barely managed to close her eyes the night before. Every time she turned her head, the image of the rusted safe beneath the barn floorboards resurfaced with startling clarity. The way the metal had glinted beneath the dirt, the hollow echo of the loosened plank, the strange certainty that the safe was never meant for anyone but her. She lay motionless for a moment, listening to the silence of the old house. Her brothers were either still asleep or already outside, but she didn't care enough to check. Her thoughts were fixed entirely on the barn and the secret that waited under its floor. The air in the guest room was cold. She rubbed her arms, stood up slowly, and splashed water on her face from the bathroom sink. The mirror reflected her tired eyes, the faint smudge of dirt still clinging to her cheek from the night before, and the stubborn determination that had begun taking shape inside her. She knew she couldn't delay. Whatever was inside that safe, whatever her father had hidden, had been buried long enough. She pulled on her boots, shrugged into her jacket, and slipped out of the house quietly. Outside, frost sparkled on the ground, like tiny shards of glass, crackling softly under her feet. The air smelled of early winter, sharp and metallic, with a hint of wood smoke drifting from a neighbor's chimney. The barn stood at the end of the path, partly shrouded in morning mist, its silhouette ghostly against the backdrop of frosted fields. As she approached, a strange mix of fear and anticipation settled in her chest. She pushed the barn doors open, and the familiar scent of old wood and dust washed over her. The interior was dim, but the rising sun sent long beams of light through the broken roof, cutting pale lines across the floor. She walked straight to the loosened plank, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Kneeling down, she brushed aside the dirt she had uncovered last night, revealing the rusted metal once more. The safe seemed even older in the morning light, its edges corroded, its surface mottled with patches of orange and brown. She slid her fingers along the cold metal. The lock was old-fashioned, mechanical, heavy, the kind used decades ago. There was no keyhole that matched any key she knew of, no digital panel, just a circular dial stiff with age. She tried to turn it gently, but it barely moved. Her father had always been good with things like this. He could fix nearly anything: tractors, locks, engines, anything except the rift that had grown between his children. She wondered when he had built this hiding place, and why he had never told her about it. The thought of him kneeling right where she was, kneeling now, sent a shiver through her. She stood up and began searching the barn for tools. The old workbench was cluttered with rusted wrenches, broken nails, bits of string, and an assortment of keys that clearly belonged to locks long gone. Nothing seemed promising until she opened a small metal box tucked behind a dusty oil can. Inside were thin strips of metal, oddly shaped and slightly curved at the ends. She recognized them almost immediately handmade lockpicks. Her father had shown her how to use one once, years ago, when she was 14, and had accidentally locked herself out of the house. He had laughed then, a deep, warm sound she could almost hear again if she closed her eyes. He'd said, "Locks aren't to keep you out if you're meant to get in." At the time, she hadn't understood what he meant. Now the words felt heavier, almost prophetic. She returned to the safe and knelt again. The cold from the floor seeped into her knees. Holding one of the picks between her fingers, she studied the lock. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The metal was worn, stiff from years of disuse, and she would have to be patient and gentle, coaxing it rather than forcing it. She inserted the pick carefully and began turning the dial little by little, listening for the faintest clicks beneath the rust. Time stretched. Minutes folded into each other. Her fingers ached. Her back throbbed from leaning forward. Each tiny movement of the dial felt like an argument with the past. She thought of her brothers, of the way they had looked at her yesterday, dismissive, amused, so sure of their superiority. She thought of the will reading, of how small she had felt sitting in that chair as the lawyer listed everything the farm had to offer, everything she would never touch again. Perhaps this safe was her father's way of balancing the scales. Perhaps he had known exactly how his sons would behave. The thought gave her strength. She pressed her ear closer to the safe and continued working. At last, after what felt like hours, she heard it. A faint metallic release, a soft internal click that signaled the tumblers falling into place. Her heart leapt. She held her breath, afraid to believe it. Slowly, cautiously, she tugged at the handle. It resisted at first, then groaned open, sending a puff of stale air into her face. She coughed, waving away the dust, then leaned closer, peering into the darkness inside. At first, she saw only shadows. Then she reached for her phone, turned on the flashlight, and shone it into the safe. The hollow space glowed back at her. Her breath caught again, this time in disbelief. On the top layer lay a small velvet pouch tied with a faded ribbon. Next to it were several neatly wrapped bundles in brown paper, secured with twine. Underneath them, thick envelopes bulged with age, their edges frayed. She lifted the velvet pouch first. It was heavier than it looked. When she loosened the ribbon and opened it, something warm and golden glimmered inside. Gold coins, dozens of them, each one catching the thin beam of her flashlight like a tiny sun. She held one up, feeling its weight, turning it between her fingers. The coin bore a date from the late 1800s. She felt dizzy. This alone was worth a small fortune. With trembling hands, she set the pouch aside and reached for one of the brown paper bundles. The paper tore softly under her touch, and she found herself staring at jewelry necklaces, rings, brooches, each one polished though old, intricate in design. Some pieces were clearly antique, others were likely heirlooms. A silver brooch shaped like a leaf seemed familiar. She lifted it, her heart tightening as she remembered seeing it on her mother's dress in an old photograph. A lump formed in her throat. She continued unpacking the safe with growing awe and disbelief. Under the jewelry and coins were envelopes filled with cash-old banknotes, but still valid, neatly stacked and rubber-banded together. There were certificates of authenticity for the coins, insurance papers for the jewelry, documents that could prove ownership and value if she needed them. And then she saw it. A single envelope, yellowed with age, her name written across the front in her father's unmistakable handwriting. To my daughter, Miriam. Her hands shook as she picked it up. The paper felt thin and fragile, as though it might crumble if she breathed too hard. She sat back on the floor, legs folded beneath her, and opened it. Inside was a letter, several pages long. The handwriting was uneven, his usual pen strokes shaky. It must have been written during the last months of his life, when his illness had begun to steal his strength. My dear girl, the letter began. She held her breath. If you are reading this, then the barn and everything within it belongs to you alone. I want you to know that I never doubted your heart. Your brothers are capable men in their own ways, but they do not understand the difference between owning something and valuing it. You always understood. Even when you left, I knew it wasn't because you didn't care, but because you thought you weren't wanted. You were wrong. You were always my anchor. She stopped reading for a moment, blinking through the sting in her eyes. Her father wrote about how he had saved the coins and jewelry over decades. Some he inherited from his own father, some he bought gradually, with money set aside from harvests and repairs he had done for neighbors. He explained that he hadn't trusted the rest of the family to handle these things wisely. He feared that if his sons knew about the safe, they would squander its contents within weeks. "I want you to build a life that is truly yours," he wrote. "Use this carefully. Use it well. And above all, do not let anyone take it from you. They will try, but you must stand firm. You are stronger than you think." The final lines were shaky, the ink darker where the pen had pressed too hard. "I love you, Miriam. More than the farm, more than the land, more than anything I leave behind. This legacy is yours because you earned it, not through labor, but through loyalty, kindness, and a heart that never hardened. Please forgive me for what I could not say while I was still alive." She pressed the pages to her chest. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, falling onto the dusty floor. For a long time, she didn't move. She let the weight of her father's words settle into her bones, comforting and heartbreaking all at once. It felt as though he were there beside her, guiding her trembling hands, telling her gently that she had always been more than enough. When she finally stood up, the barn seemed different, warmer, fuller, as if her father's presence lingered in every shadow. She carefully repacked the safe, hiding everything just as she had found it, except for the letter, which she kept close. She planned to return later with proper containers, maybe a lockbox, perhaps something more secure. But for now, secrecy was her strongest shield. As she closed the safe and lowered the floorboard back into place, a quiet resolve formed within her. She would protect this. She would honor her father's trust. And she would not tell her brothers, not ever. But as she walked toward the barn doors, she noticed something that made her stop cold. A faint boot print in the thin frost by the doorway. It was fresh, and it didn't belong to her. She glanced back at the barn, sudden fear tightening her throat. The safe's secret had survived for decades, but now she realized she might not be the only one who knew something valuable was hidden here. The morning sun had risen fully, but the light outside suddenly felt colder. Miriam stepped out into the yard, clutching her father's letter, her breath clouding in the air. For the first time since opening the safe, she understood the true weight of what she had found. Her father had given her a treasure, but he had also given her a battle, and it was about to begin. The wind sharpened as the days grew colder, sweeping across the Harper property with a chill that settled into the bones of the land itself. Miriam felt that same cold inside her, a quiet tension that never quite left her since the morning she found the footprint in the frost outside the barn. Though she tried to reassure herself that it could have been anyone, a repairman, a neighbor passing by, even an old print thawing from the day before. Something in her gut told her that it wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been watching, or at the very least, someone had wandered close enough to the barn to make her uneasy. And uneasiness, she had learned, was rarely without reason. In the days that followed her discovery, Miriam carried the letter from her father with her everywhere, folded carefully and tucked into the inner pocket of her jacket. She reread it every night, sometimes twice, the words grounding her like an anchor, while the rest of her life felt unpredictably adrift. She had not yet decided exactly what to do with the contents of the safe. For now, secrecy felt like the only protection she had. She returned to the barn only when the house was empty, tiptoeing down the hallways like a trespasser in her own childhood home. She moved quietly, avoiding creaking boards, avoiding unnecessary questions from Daniel or Adam. They were already suspicious. She could feel it. Every glance felt heavier, every passing comment edged with something sharper than curiosity. Her brothers had always been temperamental, but after the reading of the will, their moods had shifted from cold indifference to thinly veiled resentment. They had expected to receive everything, every acre, every building, every scrap of their father's legacy. In their eyes, Miriam had taken something that belonged to them, even if they didn't yet know its true worth. It didn't take long for Daniel to make the first move. She found him waiting outside the barn one late afternoon, leaning against the fence with his arms crossed, an expression that hovered somewhere between feigned concern and barely contained irritation. She slowed her steps as she approached, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. The air smelled of damp leaves and the faint scent of manure from the fields. "You've been spending a lot of time in there," he said, tilting his head toward the barn door. "More than you ever did when Dad was alive." Miriam forced a calm expression. "I'm cleaning. It's a mess." He raised an eyebrow. "Cleaning? You've been obsessed with it. Every morning, every night. And you don't even let anyone else go inside." "It's my property," she reminded him softly. "Dad left it to me." "That doesn't mean you get to lock everyone out." His voice hardened. "It's still part of the family farm." "No," she said, keeping her tone even, though her stomach tightened. "It's not. It's mine alone." He pushed off the fence and took a slow step toward her. "I don't like secrets, Miriam. And you're acting like you found something." Her breath caught for a moment, but she didn't answer. Silence, she figured, was safer than denial or explanation. Daniel studied her face, searching for the truth she refused to give. His eyes narrowed. "You know, you've always been a terrible liar." That night, she dreamed of locks snapping, floorboards splintering, rough hands tearing into her father's legacy. When she woke, her sheets were tangled, and her throat was dry. She sat up in bed and waited for her pulse to slow, but the fear remained, a dull ache in the center of her chest. The next morning, she found footprints inside the barn. They were faint, smeared slightly by hay and dust, but undeniably fresh. Someone had been in there, walking the board she had walked, stepping dangerously close to the concealed section of floor. She knelt beside the prints, examining them with a tight jaw. Large, heavy, boot-shaped. Not hers. Not delicate enough for a woman's shoe. Not small enough to be a child's. Daniel. Or Adam. Or both. Her breath trembled as she stood. She locked the barn door behind her, something she hadn't done since she was a child, and returned to the house with her thoughts racing. She moved carefully, listening for sounds from her brothers. She found Adam in the kitchen, rummaging through the fridge, a half-open beer bottle sitting next to him on the counter. He glanced at her with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she answered. "Must be that barn," he said with a shrug. "Old buildings make strange noises." Miriam watched him closely, trying to decipher whether he was hinting at something. But Adam, unlike Daniel, had never been subtle. If he knew anything, he would have said it outright or mocked her for it. Still, she remained silent. Silence, she reminded herself again, was her armor. The following days unfolded with growing tension. Her brothers whispered behind closed doors. Their moods soured further. Their tempers sharpened. And then one evening, when she returned to the barn after dinner, she found the lock broken. The twisted metal hung uselessly from the latch, the door slightly ajar. Her stomach dropped. She pushed the door open with trembling hands. The interior lay in semi-darkness, the air stirred by a faint draft. She stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath her. Straw had been kicked aside, tools overturned. Someone had torn through the barn in a frantic search. But the floorboard, the one under which the safe was hidden, remained undisturbed, still perfectly in place. Either they hadn't known to look there, or they hadn't found what they were seeking quickly enough. She exhaled shakily, relief and fear mingling until they tasted bitter on her tongue. She knelt quickly and lifted the board. The safe was intact, everything inside undisturbed. She replaced the board, swept the area clean with her hands, and hurried out, heart pounding. That night, the confrontation came. She had just finished washing dishes when Daniel walked into the kitchen. His expression darkened the moment he saw her. Adam followed close behind, arms folded, lips curled in a tight smirk. She dried her hands slowly, preparing herself. "We need to talk," Daniel said. Miriam nodded. "About what?" He stared at her, eyes cold. "The barn? What's in it?" Her pulse skipped. "Tools, junk, dust. Why do you care?" Daniel slammed his hand onto the table, making her flinch. "Don't play dumb. You've been hiding something. I want to know what it is." She swallowed hard and steadied herself. "I told you. I'm just cleaning." "Bullshit." Adam stepped closer. "You think we don't see what's going on? You think we're blind? You're hiding something valuable." Daniel nodded. "And we're entitled to it." "No," she whispered. "You're not." Adam's eyes darkened. "Dad's stuff belongs to all of us." "Not the barn," she said firmly. "Read the will." Daniel shook his head. Dad was confused. He was sick. He didn't know what he was doing. Her voice rose. He knew exactly what he was doing. "Then we'll fix it legally," Daniel snapped. "We already talked to a lawyer. If you don't tell us what you found, we'll take you to court. And we'll win." The words struck her like a blow. The last shred of calm she had been clinging to snapped. Her hands trembled slightly, but she did not lower her gaze. "You won't win," she said softly, "because there's nothing to win." But even as she spoke, she knew her brothers would not stop. They had tasted suspicion and greed, and now they would chase the scent like wolves. The next week brought legal papers, a formal notice, a summons. Her brothers were attempting to claim the barn as part of the estate, arguing that their father had been incompetent during his final months, that the will was unclear, that she was unlawfully withholding property. The language was crafted to intimidate, sharp and condescending. She felt her stomach knot as she held the papers, the weight of them far greater than the ink on their pages. She needed help. She needed someone who could fight with her, someone who understood the law better than her brother's hired lawyer. She made calls, drove to town, visited offices with wood-paneled walls and dusty file cabinets. Some lawyers were too busy, others too expensive. She felt small and lost, moving through a maze she didn't fully understand. But finally, she found a quiet, determined attorney named Evelyn Ward. A woman with sharp eyes, calm gestures, and a reputation for fairness. Evelyn listened as Miriam explained everything, from the barn to the safe, though she did not mention the contents, only the existence of her father's note and the hidden documentation. She placed the aged papers on the desk, their edges brittle, the ink faded, but legible. As Evelyn examined them, her eyebrows rose. "These are old," she said. "Very old, and legally sound. Your father transferred ownership properly. The barn is unquestionably yours." "Will that hold in court?" Miriam asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It will do more than hold," Evelyn said with conviction. "It will end this." The court date arrived on a bleak, cloudy morning. The courthouse smelled of disinfectant and cold air, the walls pale and unwelcoming. Miriam sat beside Evelyn, hands clasped on her lap, her father's folded letter tucked beneath her sleeve for luck. Her brothers sat across the room, whispering with their lawyer a slick man with too much confidence and too little decency. When the judge entered, the courtroom fell silent. The proceedings began. Her brother's lawyer spoke first, laying out accusations with the smoothness of someone accustomed to twisting truth. He painted Miriam as secretive, emotionally unstable, manipulative. He claimed that her father had been mentally unfit, influenced by her, confused at the time of the will's drafting. Miriam listened, each word like a stone thrown against her ribs, bruising but not breaking. Then Evelyn rose to speak. Her voice was calm but firm, steady as a river cutting through rock. She presented the documents her father had hidden. She explained the historical transfer of ownership, the notarized records, the signatures spanning decades. She spoke of legal processes her brother's lawyer had clearly not anticipated. The judge studied the papers with growing interest. Miriam watched his eyes scan the pages, saw his expression shift from curiosity to comprehension. Her brothers' faces tightened. After what felt like an eternity, the judge set the papers aside and cleared his throat. "The evidence is clear," he said. "The East Barn and its surrounding land were lawfully assigned to the sole ownership of Miriam Harper. This court recognizes the validity of these documents, the claim filed by Daniel and Adam. Harper is denied." Silence followed, heavy, suffocating. Miriam exhaled shakily, tears gathering behind her eyes. Relief rushed through her like warm water, washing away weeks of fear and uncertainty. Her brothers stared at her with a mixture of anger and disbelief. But she didn't look away. For the first time in years, she held their gaze without shrinking. As the courtroom emptied, she stepped outside into the cold afternoon air. The sky was still gray, but somehow lighter. She stood on the courthouse steps, breathing deeply, feeling the weight on her chest loosen. The battle her father had warned her about had begun, and she had won the first fight. But as she returned to the farm, her steps steady and her resolve firmer than ever, she knew this wasn't the end. The greed she had seen in her brother's eyes would not simply fade with a judge's decision. The storm wasn't over, but neither was she. And now, with her father's legacy safely concealed beneath the barn floor, she finally understood the truth he had left her. Strength did not come from land or inheritance. It came from standing alone and standing firm. The storm had passed, but the memory of it still clung to the air the next morning, as though the sky hadn't fully decided whether to release the last of its anger or allow peace to return. The yard was soaked, the mud thick beneath Miriam's boots, and the barn smelled faintly of damp hay and cold metal. She moved slowly as she approached it, not because she was tired, though she was, but because she knew what waited inside. The night before had been a blur of fear, confrontation, and realization, each part leaving behind a different kind of bruise on her heart. Her cousins had shown their true intentions clearly. What began as sneers and laughter at her inheritance had sharpened into something darker the moment they heard whisper of the safe, the old coins, the gold. They had not needed to know the truth. Greed never asked for proof. It only needed a rumor strong enough to carry it in the wind. Miriam had seen the shift in their eyes the moment the lawyer mentioned the barn. She had felt it again yesterday, when she noticed that strange boot print in the frost. And she felt it even more deeply last night, when their arrival and their threats had nearly ignited into something uglier. Now she walked toward the barn with the same quiet determination she had felt as a girl whenever she followed her father through the fields. He had always said, "Be steady," even when others shake. She clung to that now. Inside, the barn looked unchanged. Dust hanging in the light, scattered tools, old boards that creaked beneath her steps. But to her, nothing looked the same. Everything had become a battleground, a place where family ties had been tested and nearly severed entirely. She walked toward the loose floorboard with a slow breath, kneeling down to touch the wood as though it were fragile skin. The safe beneath it remained hidden, untouched, sealed as she had left it. That alone made her shoulders relax slightly. Her cousins had tried to intimidate her last night, but they hadn't dared break inside the barn. Not yet. She lifted the floorboard, just enough to check. The safe's metal glinted faintly in the soft light. She let the board fall gently back into place. There would be time to pack everything later. For now, she needed to think. The fight was not over. Not with the safe, not with her cousins, not with the legacy her father had trusted her to protect. She sat in the center of the barn, hands clasped in her lap. The air was cold but calming, and she needed that calmness to gather her thoughts. Her father's letter lay in her pocket, folded carefully, as though it were made of something finer than paper, something irreplaceable. She pulled it out, feeling the familiar tremble in her hands as she read the last lines again. "You are stronger than you think." She closed her eyes, letting the words sink deeper into her. She would need every ounce of that strength now. She stayed there until the morning sun climbed higher, warming the boards around her. Then she rose, dusted off her jeans, and walked back toward the house. She had a decision to make. The house felt empty when she stepped inside, but she sensed that absence wouldn't last. Her cousins would be back. People like them didn't let go of something valuable. They would return with arguments, with accusations, perhaps even with lies. They would claim ownership, demand shares, maybe call lawyers to twist the truth the way they twisted everything else. She prepared herself for the fight long before she heard their truck approach, rumbling down the dirt road with an impatience that seemed almost childish. She stood at the kitchen counter, pouring herself coffee she didn't really want, and listened as the gravel outside crunched under their tires. Doors slammed, voices murmured. Then footsteps approached the house with the same heavy certainty of a storm rolling in. She didn't move toward the door. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her hurry. When they finally knocked, sharp, aggressive blows that echoed through the old wooden walls, she exhaled slowly and opened the door. There were 3 of them. Samuel, the eldest cousin, tall and thick-shouldered. Bethany, her aunt's daughter, with arms folded and eyebrows already raised. And Mark, who rarely spoke, but followed the others like a shadow eager for someone else's light. Their expressions made her stomach tighten. The greed in their eyes had only grown stronger. "Miriam," Samuel said, forcing a smile she recognized as false. "We need to talk." She didn't step aside. "Talk, then." Bethany pushed forward. "We know about the safe, about what's inside. And if you think you're going to hide it—" "I'm not hiding anything," Miriam interrupted quietly. "But I'm not giving anything away either." Samuel's jaw clenched. The estate was supposed to be split evenly. The will wasn't fair. "You know that." "The will is the will," she replied. "You got land, money, equipment. You got everything you wanted. The barn is mine." "That barn holds our family history," Bethany snapped. "It holds my father's secrets," Miriam said, her voice steady. "And he entrusted them to me." Mark finally spoke. "We'll take this to court." She nodded. "Then do it." They hadn't expected that. Their surprise flickered through their faces like a crack in a window pane. They had hoped she would argue, panic, show her fear. Instead, she stood still, unmoving, a rooted oak against a gust of stubborn wind. Samuel stepped closer. "You're making a mistake." "No," she answered. "I'm correcting one." Their anger rose like heat off pavement, but she didn't step back. She held their gazes until finally the shift happened, a small defeat in Samuel's eyes, a frustrated twitch in Bethany's hands, a restless flicker of Mark's shoulders. They turned away eventually, leaving with the same heaviness with which they'd arrived. But she knew it wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Weeks passed, each one filled with questions, tension, and small battles. Her cousins tried gossiping around town, whispering that she had manipulated the will, that she was hiding stolen money, that she had taken advantage of their uncle's weakened mind. None of it stuck, not fully, but the whispers stung all the same. Still, she pressed forward. She contacted appraisers, lawyers, financial advisors. She cataloged every item from the safe, documenting value and authenticity so thoroughly that no lawsuit could threaten her claim. She researched trust funds, investment options, land opportunities. Slowly, she built a plan, a future. Her father had left her a treasure meant not to be squandered, but cultivated. She would honor that. The day she opened her new business account, she felt something inside her settle into place, like a puzzle piece finally finding its home. She began renovating the old farmhouse, fixing the porch, repairing the windows, replacing the sagging roof her brothers had neglected. The land seemed to come alive again as she worked, each improvement breathing new warmth into the old structure. But the biggest change came when she decided to restore the barn, not as a museum, nor a storage place for secrets, but as a part of her future. A place she could preserve while building something new. She reinforced the foundation, replaced the broken boards, and added proper lighting. She left the floorboard loose, though. Some things weren't meant to be erased. Some memories needed to remain within reach. The neighbors began noticing. They stopped by, offering help, tools, stories about her father she'd never heard. They told her how he had fixed their fences in the middle of the night, how he had left extra food on porches without a word, how he had once paid a struggling family's electric bill in full. She hadn't known any of that. Every story made her chest swell with pride and ache with loss. As she worked, she realized something new. The legacy in that safe wasn't only in coins and gold. It was in her father's heart, his intention, his belief that she would carry his goodness forward into a world that often forgot its own humanity. Months passed before her cousins finally stopped trying to sabotage her. The more she accomplished, the more futile their bitterness became. They had spent so long chasing what she had that they never considered building their own future. One day, she received a letter from Samuel, short and rigidly polite. "We withdraw our claim." She felt no triumph, only relief. Her barn was finished in early spring. The fields around it were beginning to green, soft shoots rising from thawed earth, delicate and determined. On the last day of the renovation, she stood in the open doorway, the air warm enough for a light breeze to lift her hair. She looked around at everything she had rebuilt, her home, her land, her life, and felt something shift quietly inside her. She was not the woman who had come home broken months ago. She was not the frightened daughter who had knelt before a rusted safe in search of answers. She was a woman with roots deeper than her doubts, with a future her father had believed she deserved long before she saw it herself. She walked into the barn, lifted the loose board one last time, and rested her hand on the safe. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. The sunlight spilled across the floor, warm and golden, illuminating the past and the present at once. And for the first time since her return, Miriam felt completely, undeniably free. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch the other videos on the channel. There's so much more waiting for you. And share this video with someone who loves a good story.